Matthew chapter 13. This is a long one, yes?
Yes.
It's a terribly long chapter. And we're going to dive right into the parables and examine the structure tonight. We'll talk about the purpose. We'll talk about some statements Jesus makes about why he's teaching in parables. Hopefully we'll answer some of the questions that you have and create new ones along the way. It seems to be my method as I go. Approximately one third of Jesus' teaching is in parables. Did you know that? Yeah. Roundabout numbers. So if you're not understanding the parables, or you don't want to dive into them and understand them better, you're missing out on a big chunk of what Jesus had to say. And so that's why we're spending a good portion of our time tonight on this. What is a parable? Did you look it up?
Something that goes up and comes down.
It goes up and comes down. Okay. It's like the temperature, right, in Salem. It goes up and comes down. Parable it's just a simple story that you can use to illustrate some spiritual truth, okay, or a condition. And what we see tonight is that these are either not so much spiritual lessons, but spiritual conditions. They're parables describing what is, the kingdom of heaven is like. Okay? So he uses these parables to describe a condition that's in the unseen world. Okay? We are in the third discourse. Did you remember that? How do we know we're in our third discourse of how many? 5. Matthew includes 5 discourses. Do you remember why? It's the whole Moses thing, right? 5 books of Moses, 5 discourses of Jesus. Matthew puts his teaching into those 5 discourses. This is the third of 5, which means it's the middle one, okay? And how do we know this is one of the discourses? This is review. Because at the end of every discourse, there is a trigger, a key, and it's the words, what? When Jesus had finished. And in this case, we see that in Matthew 13:53. I will talk about that later. Matthew 13:53. Let me link this up with what's on my computer. When Jesus had finished these parables. Do you see that? Okay. So that's at the end of all the parable teaching. That's how we know that this is one of the 5 discourses. Every discourse ends with that. First was Sermon on the Mount, then directions to the disciples, and now we have the parables of the kingdom. So, where does he teach these parables? Well, he seems to have parables that are taught to the public, and then explanations of those parables that are taught not to the public. And we see that in Matthew 13:1. It says, that day he went out of the house. So he's going out into the public. That's at the beginning of our chapter. And then if you remember, one of the interpretations in 13:36, see, he went back into the house. So he's going out of the house to teach to the public. He's coming back into the house. And this is where he explains the parable of the wheat and the tares. There's also an explanation of the parable of the sower that we'll talk about. It doesn't mention that he goes back into the house for the parable of the sower, but in general, what you are to understand coming out of this chapter is that he's teaching in these parables to the public. We'll discuss why. But then he also at times, and we get a glimpse into that, we get to see the discussion behind the scenes back in the house. Okay? And why is he teaching or explaining these parables behind the scenes? Well, it's kind of an interesting statement. It can be a confusing description that Jesus gives. He says that he teaches the parables to conceal the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. So he's teaching in parables to hide the truth. Does that make sense? Does it? But it doesn't seem like a very good evangelistic method. Does it? I mean, every time we go out and we share our faith, we're trying to find the best words, the most concise way, the clearest way to get the message and the truth about what the gospel message is to those people that need it. And yet in this chapter, you saw it when you studied, in this chapter, what does Jesus say? I am concealing the message. It's confusing, right? So, let's just hang on that, and I'll try and spend a little bit of time describing why and maybe some of the words that Jesus uses. Earlier, it's interesting because earlier when people came to him, back in chapter 8, verse 16, it says, when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. This is a few weeks ago. He cast out the spirits with a word. He healed all who were ill. And everybody that was coming to Jesus was getting physically healed. Their eyes were being opened, right? Their ears of the deaf were being made to hear. So in physicality, earlier in his ministry, everybody who comes gets the healing, the miraculous powers of Jesus. But here, in chapter 13, what we see, the spiritual truth is concealed to some and not to others. I want you to think of Jesus' ministry as kind of a snowball rolling downhill in big powder conditions. And what happens to a snowball in those conditions if it gets enough speed? It becomes bigger. You've seen the cartoons, right? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think that's what's happening to some extent in Jesus' ministry. What started out as a small, do you remember the first discourse, Sermon on the Mount? Was he hiding anything? Think about the words he was using there. Was he concealing anything? Or was he just kind of stating it pretty straightforwardly? It's pretty straightforwardly. But yet here we see this snowball probably building and picking up momentum. And what happens when a snowball picks up momentum, it'll pick up anything in its path along with it. And so you get, along with this momentum that Jesus' ministry is building, what you get is people that are clinging on to this momentum that are not necessarily true believers, right? And so we see that back in Matthew 12:14. It actually becomes a time when the Pharisees seek to destroy Jesus. And it seems like after this statement that Jesus starts to conceal some of his teaching, giving the keys to the kingdom out to those that would understand it, but seemingly hiding it from others. And that's confusing. Lots of different ways people have tried to describe why. I'll give you my attempt tonight. And possibly you have your own. And so I'll give you mine, but there's by no means is what I tell you tonight the only idea. So just know that as well. So he's concealing, we see that. Probably the most concerning portion of Scripture tonight that I had you guys look at in your lessons was halfway in between the parable of the soils and then the description of the soils. There's a pause. Do you remember that? And what happens in that pause? Well, they're asking the question, why do you teach in parables? And he says, to some it's been granted, and some it hasn't. And then he gets into this passage out of Isaiah chapter 6. And I had you look. This is an often quoted passage in the New Testament. Part of your lesson was to look up at some of those other. Was that helpful? Maybe? I'll tell you, when I looked up all the New Testament passages that quoted Isaiah chapter 6, I was very confused. And so that's okay if you are. I've heard a sermon by a man by the name of Gregory, and if you were to go to chapter 13 links and extra stuff that we have on the thing, there's a link to a sermon that he does on Isaiah chapter 6 that is phenomenal. And it will help in your understanding of this. I'll give you a very short preview tonight. So if you go to Isaiah 6, how many people... I asked you to go to the other New Testament passages that quote Isaiah 6. Did anybody go back to Isaiah 6 and read that? Okay? That is worthy of going back to because there's a whole context there that you need to understand. So I'm just going to take you there very quickly. In Isaiah chapter 6, what you have, Isaiah is a prophet in the Old Testament. He's a prophet to not the northern 10 kingdoms, but the southern 2 kingdoms. So Judah is the name of that kingdom. And he's a prophet to that. Judah, just so you know, if you don't know, is going to be taken into captivity very shortly. In fact, that's part of the message that Isaiah has for them. The very words of God are, you're going to be taken into captivity. Okay? But in chapter 6, Isaiah has a vision of the throne room of heaven. And he saw the Lord sitting on the throne, lofty and high up. He sees all these things. People are saying, holy, holy, holy. And it gets down, and he's trembling. And it gets down to this commission. He's cleansed, and then it gets down to this question in verse 8. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Who will be the mouthpiece of God to the nation of Judah to let them know what's about to happen, the message from God? And what does Isaiah say? Here I am, send me. I volunteer to be that mouthpiece. And God said, okay, good. Here's the message that you are to give to Judah. You signed up, remember, right? And he says, keep on listening. This is what he is to say. So let's pretend you're Judah and I'm Isaiah. I come before you as a prophet of God and I say, hey, you people, keep on listening, but don't perceive. It's an imperative, actually. It's a command. Keep on listening, but don't understand what I'm saying. Keep on looking. Don't understand. You won't understand, in other words. Render the hearts of these people insensitive. Their ears are dull, their eyes are dim. Otherwise, and this otherwise is confusing, probably the biggest confusing part. If they weren't this way, what would happen? They might see with their eyes spiritual truth. They might hear with their ears. They might understand with their hearts. And then what's the ultimate turn of events when all that happens? They would return to God and be healed. This is a confusing message, right? Gregory Beale, the link that I would really hope that you take time to listen to, he goes into great detail. He's done a great bit of study. He goes into detail and he outlines that the message that Isaiah is asked to give to the nation of Judah is a message given to idolaters, people that worship idols. And in that day, oftentimes idols were little statues of human characteristics or animal characteristics. And so if I had an idol here in my hand that I worshipped, that idol would likely have a set of eyes. Yes? But do those eyes see in my idol, especially spiritual things? They don't see anything, especially spiritual things, right? They would likely have a set of ears as well. But do those ears hear anything? Either in the physical realm or in the spiritual realm? No, they don't. And so what Isaiah is saying, or what God is saying to Isaiah is these people, the nation of Judah, they are worshiping idols that have eyes that can't see and ears that can't hear. And they have become, what happens when you worship idols is you become like that idol that you revere. So the people's eyes, just like their idols' eyes, have become eyes that do not see spiritual things. Ears that are able to hear spiritual things. And this is the condition of the people, Isaiah, that you are to go preach to. And then Isaiah has a great question that's not in the Matthew passage, but it is here. He says, and this is a good question, how long? This is like anytime I ask my boys to do some work around the house, right? They'll say, okay, I'll do it, but how long? Right? And it's an interesting answer. And the answer in so many words is, you are to preach to them, Isaiah, until the land is desolate. Meaning, until these people have been taken out of the land as a repercussion of their idolatry. And then he doesn't stop there. He says, and a tenth, eventually, a remnant will return to the land. But that remnant even will be subject to burning, judgment. God's message to Isaiah is, you're going to preach. These people will be exported. Later they will come back to the land in a small portion, but even that small portion will not have eyes to see and ears to hear. That's the prophecy coming out of Isaiah chapter 6. With that understanding, Jesus' time on earth is during what part of that story? The people have been removed, a remnant has returned, right? And Jesus shows up on the scene, and what's the spiritual condition of Israel? We've talked about this throughout Matthew. What's the spiritual condition of Israel at the time of Jesus' ministry? It's horrible. The temple is being run by pagans, right? The people don't have eyes to see and ears to hear what it is that God has to say to them. Their condition is the same as the condition before the exile. So whenever Isaiah 6 is being quoted in the New Testament, it is a mention not of some God that just sort of randomly decides that some people will hear and some people won't. It's a judgment statement saying, you people, now let me play the role of Jesus and you play the role of the people of Israel of Jesus' day. When I quote Isaiah 6 to you, the message is, you folks are the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy back in Isaiah 6. You are the folks that return to the land and yet are subject to burning. You have the same problem. It's a problem that man can't fix on his own, in other words. And that's the whole ministry of Jesus and why he showed up. Does that make sense? Okay. Spend a little bit more time on that because I think that is a highly confusing passage. And it drives people to different conclusions that I just gave you. But if you take a listen to that sermon that we've given you a link to, he goes into a lot more detail, supporting detail on that. I think that'll be helpful for you. So let's take a look at the parables. I want to take a look at the structure. I'm not going to go into great detail on any one of them. Maybe the first one, the parable of the soils, I'll walk through in a little more detail. But I'm more concerned about that you see the structure, because what we've seen out of Matthew is that he just doesn't write haphazardly, right? He actually has a structure and a purpose to the way he writes. So you would expect that if he's giving us a discourse and he's including parables, that he's making sure those are organized in a certain fashion. So let's try and identify what that fashion is, where that organization is. So he starts with parable of the sower. Okay, he starts with that. I'm going to suggest to you that there are 8 parables. I don't know, did you count them? Oh, yeah. I'm going to suggest to you there are 8. There are some people that say there's only 7, and we'll talk about why. But the parable of the sower is the first one. And if you know anything about our chiastic structure, you would think that maybe the first one is matched up with the last one, right? On a timeline, the first and the last, and we work towards the middle, right? So if that's true, the parable of the sower has something to do with the parable in Matthew 13:52 of the scribe who becomes a disciple and pulls out of his treasure house things new and old. Okay, that would be the last one. So those two are kind of paired up. And I'll explain my theory on that. Tares among the wheat is the second one, right? Now the explanation for tares is later, but the tares among wheat is the second parable. The second to last parable, so you got sower and the scribe who becomes the disciple, and then the next set in is tares among wheat and the dragnet. Do you remember the dragnet? The net drags, catches different kinds of fish, and they're sorted out, right? So let's start looking at themes. Tares among wheat. What's the idea there? Well, there's 2 types. In one field, there's 2 types of harvest, or 2 types of crop that have been sown. And they're allowed to grow up together until they present what they really are, because they're really hard to distinguish earlier than that. And then there's a harvest, And what happens at the harvest? They're identified and separated. This is the tares, this is the wheat. What happens to the tares? They're gone. Wheat goes in the storehouse. Okay. So you got tares among wheat is the second one down from the top. The second one up from the bottom is the dragnet. You've got one big net, like one big field, right? Instead of a crop with two different things in it, you got a couple different types of fish. The good fish and the bad fish. And so at the harvest, all of the fish are brought in and they are separated. Do you see the theme there? That those two match, okay? Good. So you got wheat and tares and dragnet. And then as we move towards the center, we've got 4 in the middle, and we've got 2 sets of 2, and those 2 and 2 match. I asked you about themes in your lesson. I don't know if you figured out what I was trying to get you to identify, but the mustard seed is the third one down from the top. This is a small seed that does what? It grows big. The kingdom of heaven is like this. It starts small and it grows big. And then the next one that pairs with that is the leaven, which is a small amount of leaven that does what? It envelops the whole. It becomes big and all-inclusive. Okay, so you see the theme there, that those two match. So that's 3 and 4 matching. 5 and 6 match. Hidden treasure. This is an easy one. Hidden treasure and the costly pearl, right? And what's the theme there? These are valuable things that people have found, and what are they willing to do? They're willing to sell everything, right? So you've got this sower and the scribe. I'll tie those together as best I can. Tares among wheat and dragnet share a theme, and then in the middle you've got these 2 sets. I want you to see the way that Matthew organized those. He could have put them in any order. We know from other Gospels, and we've seen this earlier in Matthew, we know from other Gospels that these are in different orders in other Gospels, and not all of them are there. So this is a literary decision by the author Matthew to take the true teachings of Jesus and organize them in such a way that is unique to his purpose. Okay? So you've got, what's the kingdom of heaven like? That's what all of these are like. That's what all of these are describing. In the kingdom of heaven, there will be a distinction, a judgment day, where some people get in and some people don't, right? We've got 2 that go after that, the fish and the tares and the wheat. It's a small thing that grows big. It's a very valuable thing, right? And I will propose to you, based on the parable of the soils and the scribe that becomes a disciple, you can't always tell from the outside who's going to accept this message and who's not, right? So as Jesus is describing all this, first context is right then and there. It's, what does it look like then and there? I'm describing. We're going to sow this gospel message about the kingdom of heaven coming, and here's kind of the responses that you will see. So let's take a look at the soils in a little more detail. I didn't do this for you. I didn't ask you to do this. But a lot of times when I teach the parable of the soils, I call it soils instead of sower, because the soils are the thing that changes, right? The sower's the same and the seed's the same, but it's the soils that are different. This is one of those that's in all 3 synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew 13, Mark 4, and Luke 8. And so it's kind of fun to look at them side by side, because each one brings out a slightly different detail. And I'll try and mention some of those as we go. It's also interesting, before we get into the parable of the sower, it's also interesting that, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, oftentimes the narrative of the gospel stories, when Jesus interacts with different people, those narratives will play out some of these parables. I don't know if you've thought about that. Let me give you a couple examples to highlight what I mean by that. We've got these 2 parables about the value of the kingdom. It's a costly pearl or a hidden treasure. And in that, what is the commonality? The people in the parable are asked to do what? They're asked to sell everything, or they're willing to sell everything they own for this very valuable thing, this thing that they see value in, worth more than anything else they own. Well, we're not quite there yet, but in Matthew chapter 19, we've got this story of the rich young ruler. Do you remember that? Those of you that have been through. What's the gist of this story? Well, you've got a man that has a lot of possessions, right? And he's asking how to get this valuable treasure. And he's told, and what's his answer? Go, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and then you will. And what's his response? He went away disappointed, right? So not the best response, but I would challenge you to think in different light. How many of you tonight, if I had the authority and told you I could guarantee you entrance to the kingdom of heaven, and all you had to do was go sell everything you own and sell it and give it to the poor, how many of you would leave incredibly happy? I would be a bit distressed myself. Does that make sense? So, that's an interesting response that we see out of the rich young ruler. As an example, a real life example of the parable, the two parables that we see in this chapter, right? On the flip side of that, over in Mark chapter 12, we've got the widow's mite. Do you remember this? Got a very poor woman, and she is at the temple treasury, and she's giving very small amount, about the amount of 1 penny. And Jesus points out, what about her giving? These other people have given out of their surplus, which is easier to do, but she has given what? Everything. She's a living example of the parable of the costly pearl. She has realized that this thing is worth everything I have. Right? So sometimes what we see in the narrative of the Gospels is a playing out, a real life playing out of these parables with real people, not just hypotheticals. Okay? So the parable of the sower. You've got how many types of ground? 4. We've got 4 types of ground. Okay? Let's just go through very quickly. I want to point out, obviously it's in 2 parts. You've got the parable itself and then the explanation. What I'm going to try and do is point out the differences in the explanation amongst the 3 Gospels that have this parable. So in the first one, you've got ground hardened by travelers, right? It's a walking path. And this is someone that hears the explanation, hears the word, does not understand it, according to Matthew. And then he says the evil one. Matthew says evil one. What's interesting is when you go to the other Gospels how this evil one is described. Matthew says evil one. Mark says Satan comes. And Luke says the devil. It's very interesting that the 3 synoptics, the 3 authors chose 3 different names for this character who comes, takes away the word so that they may not believe. Luke says, different than just Matthew's rendition, so that they may not believe and be saved. That's the result of him taking this away. They may not believe and be saved. Then you've got number 2, the rocky places, right? This is someone who receives the word with joy but has no root. Some of you are thinking about people in your life, maybe a time in your life where this may have been true, who received the word with joy but has no root. Trouble comes, persecution, and then they fall away. Interestingly, Luke gives some great detail here. He says, they believe for a while, but in the time of testing, not persecution, but he says testing, which has a slightly different connotation to it, but in the time of testing, they fall away. Interesting. Okay, so that's the second. Number 3 is the thorny ground. Remember that? The one who hears the word, and then as Matthew says, the worries of this life I really like looking at the three Gospels in this one. The worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, choke it, making it unfruitful. There's a plant there, it's just not producing fruit. That's out of Matthew. Mark says, what makes it unfruitful? It's the desires for other things come in. So it's not just the deceitfulness of wealth, which, by the way, who is captured by the deceitfulness of wealth? The rich young ruler, right? He had 2 platters, and in this, he had the kingdom of heaven, and on this, he had his possessions, his earthly possessions, and he put them on a scale, and he was deceived in the value of this tray over this tray. Wealth has a deception that goes along with it. It has a sense of permanence and security that can only be temporary by its definition. And when you weigh that against what the kingdom of heaven offers, there's no comparison. So this thorny ground, you got an unfruitful character because of being deceived by wealth. The desires for other things come in. Luke says life's worries, riches and pleasures cause it not to mature. This person's faith is not allowed to grow to maturity. And what happens at maturity? You start producing, if you're a plant and you're mature, you start producing a crop. Fruit. Okay? And then we've got soil number 4, which is the good soil. Everybody agrees this is the A-OK soil, right? It produces the crop. It doesn't have any thorns and thistles in the way. There's no rocks. The rocks have been cleared, right? It's not hardened path. So what's interesting, even though Christ interprets this parable, there's still quite a discussion as to what's going on in the interpretation of this parable. I don't know if you've thought about it this way, but there's no question. One of the big questions people ask is, who in this group of 4 is going to heaven? Did you ever ask that question? Which of these soils produces somebody that goes to heaven? Well, number 1 is out, right? Okay, no question. Number 4, in. No question. So really the question is, what's going on with 2 and 3? Are they going to make it into heaven? Is often the question that you get if you read commentaries. My purpose in going through this is just to suggest to you that I don't think that's the purpose of this parable. I don't think the purpose of this parable is to say, here's who gets into heaven and here's who doesn't get into heaven. I think the purpose is something bigger than that in the original context of when you spread the seed of the gospel, you will get different responses. People will give you different responses, and you need to know that oftentimes those responses are a result of the type of ground that person has before you even throw the seed on it. Right? But don't discriminate when you're throwing the seed. Don't look at that soil and say, that's a hardened person. That person has been trampled upon, so I'm not going to share the gospel there because I've concluded in my mind that they'll never respond. Okay? That's not your job. Your job is to spread the gospel. But just know it will receive different responses. And if you take a look at your own personal walk, this may be a point in time response. At times, have I been deceived by wealth? Well, I'm sorry, but who hasn't? That's part of the challenge of being alive, is that you are deceived by things and you try and find security in things that don't offer the security that Jesus offers. Okay? So, as we go through this, I would just encourage you not to try and ask questions of a parable that it was never intended to answer. And I think this parable is not intending to answer who gets into heaven. It's how do people respond to this and why might they respond that way. Because God is not just the thrower of the gospel, the seed, He is also the master gardener, right? He is the one that can remove thistles and thorns from people's lives. He is the one that brings a rototiller through the hard path that somebody has been trampled upon their entire life. He is the one that clears the rocks. He is a master gardener. And so even though someone may be in a condition currently, that doesn't mean they're always going to be there. Their response can change. And I think as we go through and get to the end of this chapter, I'm going to try and tie this first parable of these 4 different types of soil in with this very short last parable. Chapter 13. Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. Here we go. If you come down to the very end, this last one is the parable of the scribe. Here, verse 52. Jesus says to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of household who brings out his treasure, both things new and old." This is my guess. I haven't read this anywhere, and people have lots of different opinions, whether this one's even a parable or not. Some people just think it's a simile, and it doesn't have the force of a parable. I'm not sure what that means, but I'm concluding that it is a parable, and if it is chiastically with that parable that talks about 4 different soils. And it seems to me, every scribe who becomes a disciple of the kingdom of heaven. What do we know about scribes thus far in Matthew's presentation of what Jesus says about scribes? Who are they linked with? Scribes and Pharisees. They're one of the religious leaders of the day. Are they generally good people, spiritually speaking? Do they understand? No, in fact, they're exactly the opposite. If they were one of the soils, typically, characteristically, which soil would they be? A scribe.
Thorns.
They could be a thorn, but oftentimes, Jesus in his description of the religious leadership isn't saying you have a faith and it's been choked out. What he is saying is, if God were your father, you would recognize me, but he is not your father. You have a different father, that is Satan. That's what's coming. That's his description. So a scribe, you would think a scribe is a number 1 soil, right? A hardened path for Satan. But what does Jesus say here? Therefore, every scribe who has become what? A disciple. What type of soil? But the best case scenario, it's a 4, right? It's the good soil that produces a crop. Every number 1 that becomes a number 4. I think that's a connection. I think as we look at the characteristics of this kingdom of heaven, what we can see, what we can expect is a different response. We can expect a final judgment where God will make the final decision and do the work that I can't do because I can't see people's hearts. I can expect something small that grows very big, right? And I can expect change along the way. Not only in myself, but in those that I share it with. And those are the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, taught by Jesus in the parables of Matthew chapter 13. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, thanks for tonight. Thanks for a chance to dive into the mysteries of your kingdom. Get a glimpse behind the curtain as to how it is that it functions. And some of us have really gotten a taste of your kingdom. We've gotten a taste of what the seed can do, what fruit is like, and even what you can be doing for us as a master gardener. And God, we don't desire that just for ourselves. We desire that for the rest of the world. So God, give us courage as we go out, not to have expectations of what might be accepted and what might not be accepted, but just have the willingness to throw the gospel out there. And in turn, expect that you will be doing and being faithful to your job that we know you are. In Jesus' name, amen.